There's a moment that happened at Windsor Castle earlier this year that most people outside the specific world of royal watching never heard about, and the way it happened is almost as interesting as the fact that it happened at all. Prince William stepped forward at an investiture ceremony in full military dress, in the same ceremonial setting where his father has stood for decades, presiding over the formal conferral of honors in the monarch's name, with exactly the composure and authority of someone who has been doing this for years, which, in a sense and in multiple capacities, he has. But the detail that royal commentators picked up on was not the ceremony itself, which has precedent, but the energy around it. One observer who has covered royal events for a long time put it simply and precisely. What you are watching now is not just a son helping out his father. It is something else. Something that sits between assistance and leadership, between preparation and already arrived, and that is increasingly difficult to describe with the language the monarchy usually uses for the relationship between a reigning monarch and their heir. And that observation, from someone who chose their words carefully, gets at the heart of something that more and more people who study this institution closely are noticing. Prince William's quiet leadership is no longer quite as quiet as it used to be. This isn't a story about a coup or a challenge to the king's authority or any kind of formal transfer of power. Charles remains the monarch, fully and constitutionally, and by all accounts both he and William are comfortable with the arrangement they have developed, one in which the heir takes on progressively more weight and more visibility in recognition of the practical reality that a king undergoing cancer treatment while simultaneously navigating a family in extraordinary difficulty needs his heir to do more than attend ceremonial occasions and chair the occasional charity meeting. But it is a story about how leadership actually develops, about the particular, specific, documented ways in which one of the most closely watched men in the world has been quietly, deliberately, and increasingly visibly building the habits, the relationships, the decision-making capacity, and the institutional authority that a future king needs to have already developed before the crown arrives on his head. Because by every credible account available, that building is already well advanced, and the picture that emerges when you look at the specific evidence is of a leadership style that is genuinely distinctive, genuinely interesting, and in some respects, genuinely surprising. Let's start with the social media strategy, because it's one of the most concrete and most revealing expressions of how William has been redefining the relationship between the monarchy and the public in real time. Earlier this year, in May, William quietly visited St. George's Park, the National Football Training Center, to meet with England manager Thomas Tuchel's backroom staff ahead of England's World Cup campaign. It was an unannounced, informal visit, the kind that would once have been noted in the court circular the following day and briefly reported in the royal pages of the major newspapers, generating a polite paragraph or two before moving on. Instead, what happened was this. The visit went unreported by the traditional press. It was not logged in the official court circular until weeks later. And when it finally became public, it did so through a 58-second social media montage, polished, timed, and released directly to millions of followers without any newspaper or broadcaster as the intermediary. The public saw exactly what William's team wanted them to see, in exactly the format they chose, reaching exactly the audience they were targeting, on their own timeline rather than the news cycles. One royal commentator who studied this episode in detail described it as the latest evidence of a calculated, sophisticated communications strategy, one in which the Wales operation is essentially cutting out the traditional media middleman and speaking directly to the public through platforms where William's own voice and framing shapes the narrative entirely. And it worked. The footage went viral. The warmth and informality it projected, William clearly at ease, clearly interested in the football conversation rather than performing interest in it, landed with exactly the audience the World Cup engagement was designed to reach. That strategic approach to communications is itself a form of quiet leadership that tends to get underappreciated in coverage that focuses primarily on what William says rather than how he chooses to say it and to whom. For most of the monarchy's modern history, the relationship with the media was managed through a small network of royal correspondents, trusted journalists with access in exchange for broadly sympathetic coverage, and through official channels like the court circular and the press office. This system worked for a different media era, but it gave the institution relatively limited control over the actual framing and reach of its communications, depending as it did on journalists to interpret and relay what they saw. William's operation appears to have made a fundamental decision to build its own direct relationship with the public, using social media and carefully produced content to bypass that intermediary layer wherever possible, and to ensure that the Wales family's public identity is shaped by their own creative decisions rather than by the judgments of reporters who may have their own angles and agendas. The trade-off, as one commentator noted, is between the transparency that comes from traditional media coverage, which lets the public see what the royals are doing with public funds through an independent journalistic lens, and the control that comes from a direct communications model, which lets the institution manage its own narrative with a precision that earlier generations of the family could only have dreamed of. William appears to have made that trade consciously and deliberately, and the polling consistently backs the decision. He and Kate remain by a clear margin the most popular members of the royal family, and among younger audiences who consume most of their information through social platforms, that popularity is particularly strong. But the communication strategy, however sophisticated, is ultimately just the visible surface of a much deeper and more substantive leadership development that's been happening simultaneously. Royal expert Hilary Fordwich, speaking to Fox News Digital, put it directly when she said that much of what we don't see front and center is actually rather critical in this molding of the monarchy's future image to ensure it remains relevant. That phrase, much of what we don't see, is exactly right, because the most significant leadership work William has been doing happens precisely out of the camera's range. Palace aides who have spoken about this carefully and without attribution describe a man who is increasingly willing to back vital palace decisions, who has grown more strategic in his approach to the institution's challenges, and who is now seen by the people around him as genuinely prepared to make uncomfortable calls, even when those calls involve long-standing personal relationships or family members. One aide, in language that was quoted and widely circulated, said that William views public confidence as absolutely central to everything, that he understands the monarchy survives or fails on public trust, and that he has concluded difficult decisions cannot be avoided just because they can involve family members. His ability, the same aide said, to separate emotion from responsibility stands out as the quality most indicative of a future king. This language about emotional separation and difficult decisions connects directly to the most visible and most consequential example of William's leadership being exercised in practice, which is his relationship with his own uncle Andrew. Historian and royal biographer Andrew Lowney has written and spoken about this in some detail, noting that while King Charles initially had a somewhat different approach to dealing with Andrew's conduct, William was reportedly far more clear-eyed and far more decisive about what needed to happen, and that his influence within the family appears to have been a factor in the eventual definitive decision to strip Andrew of his titles and begin the eviction process from Royal Lodge. Other sources have described William's approach to his uncle's situation as almost surgical, in the word that keeps appearing in reporting on this, a willingness to cut through emotional ties and long-standing family relationships if he believes they pose a genuine risk to the institution's stability and reputation. whether that characterization entirely captures the human reality of a man who has grown up knowing his uncle since childhood. Watching him operate from the inside of the family is a harder question to answer. But what it does suggest is a future king who has arrived at a settled, clear-eyed understanding of what kind of institution he wants to lead, and who is willing to make the decisions required to get there even when those decisions are personally painful. The word ruthless has been used about William by multiple sources over the past several months, and it's worth examining that word carefully because it can carry connotations that don't quite fit the full picture. The ruthlessness being described is not cruelty or indifference to other people's pain. It's something more like a very high threshold for allowing personal affection or family loyalty to override institutional judgment. Multiple sources have noted that William maintains an unusually clear separation between his personal life, the warm, hands-on family man who plays rugby with his children at Forest Lodge and jokes about being tackled by 12-year-old George, and his institutional thinking, the future king who has concluded that the monarchy's survival depends on demonstrating genuine accountability rather than closing ranks around its own members when those members cause damage. That's a sophisticated and in many ways genuinely admirable kind of separation to maintain, and it's not one that comes easily or naturally to most people. It seems to have been arrived at through deliberate reflection rather than simply inherited as a personality trait. One specific engagement that royal commentators have identified as quietly revealing of William's leadership character is his attendance at Canterbury Cathedral in March of this year for the enthronement ceremony installing Dame Sarah Mullally as the first woman to lead the Church of England as Archbishop of Canterbury. The significance of this event for understanding William was identified clearly by expert Rebecca Russell, writing for The Express, who noted that his presence at this ceremony was far more than a PR box-ticking exercise. By attending and visibly supporting the installation of the first female archbishop, William sent a signal about his own relationship with the institution he will one day head as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a signal that, as Russell put it, dismantled the lazy narrative that has occasionally circulated about him being too secular or too modern to take his religious constitutional duties seriously. But what was equally noted in the analysis of that attendance was what it suggested about how William's faith differs from his predecessors. He is not, commentators suggested, replicating what they described as the invisible chain of piety that grounded Queen Elizabeth, nor is he adopting King Charles's more mystical, multi-faith, philosophical approach to spirituality. His approach is more modern, more grounded in the world as it actually is in the 21st century, what Russell described as quiet faith rather than demonstrative piety, but backed by a genuine commitment to the constitutional and moral responsibilities that the role carries. He is, in the characterization offered by the same expert, a man intent on driving the monarchy forward like a perfectly oiled machine with behind-the-scenes action rather than grand spectacle. That phrase, behind-the-scenes action rather than grand spectacle, is probably the single best short description of William's leadership style that any observer has produced. It's consistent with everything else that's been reported and observed about how he operates. The St. George's Park football visit that appeared as a social media clip rather than a formal press event. The palace decisions backed without public announcement. The private meetings with government figures that rarely make the court circular immediately. The working through of institutional changes that don't get announced at a press conference, but that gradually become visible in how the monarchy's operations actually function day to day. And alongside all of this invisible work, the very visible, very deliberate construction of a public identity that is warm, accessible, and recognizably human. One day visiting a food redistribution charity, rolling up his sleeves and joking with volunteers, leaving with what one journalist noted was tomato sauce splattered on his cuff. The next, representing the monarch at a D-Day commemoration, his voice catching slightly as he reads out tributes to veterans. These are not accidents or unplanned moments of authenticity. They are the product of a communications strategy sophisticated enough to know that polished inauthenticity is far more damaging than genuine human imperfection, and to plan accordingly. There's a specific quality to William's leadership approach that several commentators have identified, and that's worth naming clearly because it represents a genuine departure from the model most people associate with royal public behavior. One insider, speaking about his philosophy, said directly that William believes there are moments when silence becomes complicity, and that a modern king must have the moral courage to speak when it truly matters. That's a striking thing for a member of the royal family to believe, given that the institution's entire modern operating principle has been built on precisely the opposite assumption that the monarchy's constitutional role requires it to remain above the fray, politically neutral to the point of near silence on any contested question. William appears to be developing a more nuanced position, one that distinguishes between party political partisanship, which remains off limits, and moral engagement on questions that go beyond party politics, on issues like homelessness, mental health, and the environment, where he has been increasingly assertive and increasingly specific in his public messaging. He reportedly believes, in the words of one source, that he's not interested in being a distant figure who simply cuts ribbons and signs papers. The evolution from symbolic presence to genuine moral voice, conducted carefully and within the constitutional limits of the role, is one of the most deliberate and most ongoing projects of his public life. The impact of the past 2 years specifically, and what one commentator described as the cruel sledgehammer of disease striking both his father and his wife, has been identified by multiple sources as a significant factor in shaping the particular quality of urgency and clarity that now characterizes William's leadership. Watching the people he loves most navigate serious illness, navigating it himself from the position of the person who has to be strong and steady for everyone else, appears to have produced in him exactly the kind of facing of mortality that tends to strip away the less important things and clarify what actually matters. His public engagement with issues like cancer screening and early childhood development and homelessness has a quality of personal investment that wasn't always as visible in his earlier public work, and that personal investment is, by most accounts, entirely genuine rather than merely strategically projected. He knows from the inside of his own life why these things matter, and that knowledge gives his advocacy for them a credibility that no amount of media training could manufacture. Where all of this leads, taken together, is to a picture of quiet leadership that is considerably more coherent, considerably more deliberate, and considerably more advanced in its development than the conventional narrative of a prince in waiting simply biding his time would suggest. William is not waiting, he is building. The social media strategy that bypasses traditional media gatekeepers, the palace decisions backed without fanfare, the clear-eyed separation of institutional judgment from personal affection, the support for the first female archbishop, the food charity visit with tomato sauce on the cuff, the voice catching slightly at the D-Day commemoration, the 58-second football video that reached millions without a single newspaper involved. Each of these things individually might look like a small moment in the ongoing story of a prominent public figure doing his job. Taken together, they sketch the outline of a future king who has already, in the ways that matter most, begun to become exactly what the institution needs him to be. Not a replica of his father or his grandmother. Not the polished, distant, majestic figure that earlier eras of royalty projected, but something genuinely of this moment, of this generation, of this particular set of challenges and opportunities. A man driving the monarchy forward like a perfectly oiled machine with behind-the-scenes action rather than grand spectacle. Quietly, deliberately, and increasingly, unmistakably, effectively.